Hello, and welcome to the series premiere of our latest six-part webinar series, which we're presenting research from our latest study on emerging technologies. I'm Jerry Murphy, Senior Vice President of Research and Consulting from Nemertes. I'll encourage you to submit any questions during this presentation. Depending on the question and the flow, I may answer them right away, or I may answer them at the end. There should be plenty of time for question and answer. At the end, I'll answer as many questions as I have time to get to. And with that, let's get started. This is our Emerging Technologies Research Study for 2022-2023. What we did is we interviewed 20 different people across 10 different industries. 7 of them were financial firms. These were generally large enterprises. The median employee count was 700, not the mode, but that was the median. The median annual revenue was $6.3 billion. These are generally pretty large companies that we did this study. And instead of merely having somebody fill out a survey, we actually interviewed them so that we can make sure people understood the intent of our questions and we could get full responses from people and detailed comments. Specifically, what we were looking at was the benchmarking the adoption rate of different bellwether emerging technologies at enterprise organizations, and also what those enterprises' maturity levels were in terms of adopting those technologies. We did live interviews, and we were really looking at the status of the deployment of those technologies, what people felt the value of those technologies were to them, as well as the maturity in people's ability to take on new technology. We did these interviews in April, May, and June this year, and then I spent basically end of June compiling the data and put together the presentation, which we're doing the summary of today. Following this is the initial presentation. We'll have 5 other presentations over the next few weeks that will be going through the details of each of these 10 broad areas. We did amplified intelligence, intelligent automation, client experience, cloud computing, data and analytics, frontier technology, security and privacy, workplace technology, infrastructure, and fintech. Now, what do we mean by those exactly? Right here, we have the definitions of what we meant by those. I'm just going to go through a couple of them here. I think most of them are, cloud computing is pretty self-evident, I think. But what we meant, for example, by amplified intelligence was machine learning, computer vision, the compute layer, engineering, tools and platforms, data management, and responsible artificial intelligence associated with that. To differentiate that with intelligent automation, which is really automating the performance and streamlining processes for people. So things like remote process automation, low code, no code automation, and use of things like conversational AI and chatbots. The other thing I want to talk about is really fintech, which we mean there is really the technologies involved specifically in financial services functionality, things such as digital assets, Bitcoin, decentralized finance. The other one, to clarify, is frontier technology. And what we really mean by that is cutting edge technologies, things such as virtual reality, artificial reality, non-fungible tokens, quantum computing, cobots, which are cooperative robots, digital twinning, distributed autonomous organizations. So those are really sort of some of the completely new, relatively speaking, technologies that are out there. Now, what we mean by bellwether technologies are those technologies that are really, from our perspective, indicators of the maturity of the entire technology area. It would be almost impossible to look at every single type of technology in any given technology area. That was not our intention. We really looked within each of those areas we just showed. We looked at anywhere from 3 to 8 specific examples of technology within those areas as representative. So we know that they're not exhaustive, but it is in our mind a way to get sort of a quick and dirty assessment of firms' technical sophistication. There's certainly sometimes they're not technologies specifically. Sometimes it really was applications oriented around particular technology scenarios. For example, in fintech, that you really sometimes have applications, not necessarily technology per se. Um, Now, when we looked at the state of maturity, what is it that we're looking at? We looked at the state of technology adoption. I'm kind of going through the columns here. What is the perceived value of the technology? So, our questions that we were asking were not as a resulting in putting in this technology, how many millions of dollars did you make? It was really more qualitative, how whether you're using the technology or not, how does your company perceive this technology's value to your enterprise if having implemented or were you to implement it? Then we looked at maturity really in terms of people and process, right? Do you have teams that are working with this technology? Do you have metrics and key performance indicators that give you an ability to specifically measure success in those areas? Do you have budgets either this year, next year, or in upcoming years? Do you have a way to govern that technology? Do you have training for that technology? Have you updated your operations so that you can maximize use of the technology? Uh, do you have an architecture? Have you modified your architecture for that? And have you figured out how you're going to integrate whatever that technology is into your existing infrastructure? So those are the questions we asked. And then um, uh, we looked at how to evaluate those, which I'll cover a little bit later. Now, what are some of the key findings that we came up with here? The most mature of all these areas was data and analytics. Now, for me, it was a little bit surprising because so many times when I'm talking to clients and when I'm reading the news and when I'm looking in tech journals, everybody's talking about security, all the things going on with security threats, new emerging security technology, ransomware, the spam bots, and all that kind of stuff. Similarly, a lot of people are talking about cloud and software as a service and all that. And while those are important technologies to people and they're concerned about them, in my conversations with people, the thing that came out loud and clear was data and analyzing data is absolutely what we use to drive our business. And that's where, regardless of all the marketing hype, where people are focusing their organizations, their funding, and their people is really around data and analytics. That by far was the most mature and important technology area to almost every single company. What was least mature? Interestingly, client experience. We'll cover that a little bit more later, but the interesting thing there is people talk about how important clients are to us, how important our employees are to us, and making sure that all of their stuff at their endpoints is working good. But there's a big gap between what people say is important and what people are doing in terms of funding, leveraging technology, providing training. Those are things that for most people are really seriously missing. Certainly, security is pretty mature. Every participant had budget, had training for security. And yet, interestingly, there's 25% of the people that saw not value now specifically in new security technology. So clearly people have things like firewalls, people have things like identity management. Most people have implemented things like a multi-factor authentication. But when it comes to newer technologies like how I'm going to help you sift through all of your information in your environment to automatically take security actions, how am I going to do things like data loss prevention? When you're looking at some of the newer security technologies, people are really like, I want to make sure that actually makes sense and it works and I know how to use it before I'm going to simply embrace the latest security thing that comes along, which to some sense indicates a level of maturity there. Surprisingly, participants were relatively unprepared for cloud. So, and that is 50% of the people I surveyed were, by our definitions, unprepared for using this technology. And what I see happening there is people realize there's cloud there, but I think what's happening is people are just assimilating things. So, for example, you'll have a vendor that has a piece of software, it was sitting on your server in your data center. And then that company said, "Oh, I'm offering that as software as a service in my cloud." Perfect example of that is Microsoft Office 365, right? So it used to be people had Exchange and it was sitting on their server in their data center. Now Microsoft is saying, instead of paying me one time for getting this software in your data center, you're going to pay me every single year for every single user. And I'm going to make it easy because I'll automatically update the software. But now it's back in Azure, and I don't know all the details of what's going on there. Similarly, I'm using things like Salesforce.com. If I had a troubleshooting system Remedy, now it's RemedyForce, and all these things. So now what's happened over the years is I have all these clouds, I have these software as a service applications, and they're all over the place. And so while people are using all these things, they really haven't necessarily trained their people or designed and modified the infrastructure to make sure that I can guarantee the performance and security of these now distributed business environments. And that kind of leads to the last point, which is the biggest challenge when you take this all together, is really transforming while performing. And the example I just gave, what we're seeing is people are being largely reactive. Things are happening, vendors are moving things around, and we're just reacting to them as opposed to looking at what's coming and planning for how this transformation is going to change my user experience, change the way data flows on my infrastructure, changes my security profile. And those are the things that people really need a lot more work for, that I could see. Now, I'm going to go a little bit more detail in our maturity model. I talked about the different areas. Now, when we overall assess people's maturity, we generally look at them in four areas. Either you are unprepared for new technology, and what that means is you're lacking the necessary information to make an effective decision. You're unaware or unable to respond to these emergency issues that come up when they occur. I don't have training, I don't have budget, I don't have organization. Reactive is I have the basic platforms and structures to meet my basic business requirements, but I don't really have the ability to prevent issues when they arise. And I'm really, as it says, reacting to them. Proactive is not only do I have the platforms and structures, but I actually have organizational processes, I have training, and I'm proactively addressing issues as they come up. And finally, the highest level of maturity is what we call anticipatory, which is not only having the platforms and processes and people, but I'm anticipating what's going to happen in the future. I'm saying, oh, what happens when my vendor puts their application in the cloud? What happens when I move my data center to AWS, Google, Azure, some other third party? Maybe I have a hybrid system. I'm actually thinking ahead. How is it going to change my data flow? How is that going to change my security? Is that going to change the way I need to set up my IT teams to adapt to these changes as they're coming up? And that's really the highest level of maturity in our model. Now, when you look at those characteristics that I talked about earlier on the state of adoption, the perceived value, and so on, what we're showing here is sort of algorithmically how is it we're defining that in those areas, whether you're unprepared versus anticipatory. So in technology state of adoption, we're not assuming if you're unprepared, you have none of these technologies adopted. If you're anticipatory, you have 2/3 of those technologies that we asked you about adopted. did you realize the value? If you don't see there's any value, that's a low level. Whereas if you fully realize the value for most of the uh, bellwether technologies that we're adopting, then that was anticipatory, and so on down there. As far as, do you have money? I have it now. It's planned for this year, but I don't have it yet. It's planned for next year, or I'm not considering it, or I have no plans of having the money or having KPIs, etc. So that's kind of algorithmically, as people respond to the questions, how we categorize people as being unprepared through anticipatory. Um, and here's just sort of another way of looking at it. Uh, you're qualified if both the technology adoption and the value uh, are anticipatory, and you're in at least 6 of the 9 remaining factors, you're anticipatory. That's where we put you. You're proactive. If you're either proactive or anticipatory in those areas, and you're proactive or anticipatory at least 6 of the 9, and obviously if you go all the way down to unprepared, you're not qualified as either reactive, proactive, or anticipatory. That's what put people into the unprepared category. Now, here is the high level summary of the findings. So when we took everybody's responses, we did the algorithms to figure out whether somebody's unprepared versus anticipatory. This is where it came out across the board for everyone. So when you look at this, and I'm going to throw several different slices of these up there, just to give you different sort of insights or aspects of these numbers. So when you look at unprepared, interestingly, 75% of the people that we interviewed, based on our definitions, were unprepared for client experience, which to me was really amazing. Similarly, while there's 17% of the people that are anticipatory for cloud and open source, fully 50% are unprepared, which is an interesting finding. Also interesting in security and privacy, while 67% were at the anticipatory level of maturity, there were 17% that were, by our definitions, unprepared for adopting new security technology. Really kind of interesting. Another way of looking at it here, we've got a spider diagram, which sort of shows them all on kind of the spider web, where the outside of the web is most mature, inside of the web is least mature. And here again, you can see data analytics, very, very strong, as is security and privacy, followed kind of by infrastructure and amplified intelligence. And again, you can kind of see sort of in the least mature client experience, and interestingly, fintech. Now, clearly, fintech, the only people really responding to that were the financial services firms that we were asking questions about. Another way of looking at it, we ask, when you look at perceived value, data analytics, far and away the most perceived value of a technology, least perceived value, client experience. Fintech was, even though there wasn't necessarily maturity there certainly was perceived value by fintech financial services firms in that technology. There just wasn't as much maturity, even though there was perceived value there. Security and privacy value kind of sort of in a 6 out of 10 range as far as perceived value. Workplace technology, lower value. Infrastructure, also perceived value. I think in talking to people about infrastructure, the sense was it's basic, meat and potatoes, table stakes stuff I need to do, and people didn't really, it's necessary to have, but as far as looking at it in terms of the value to the company, not the same level as the data itself. When we look at maturity, data analytics, far and away most mature of organizations, followed by security and privacy. Then it immediately kind of drops off to less than 50%, 40%-ish for amplified intelligence and infrastructure. Interestingly, maturity, as I've mentioned before, client experience very low, as is intelligent automation. And again, having to do with where the organization and training were around these, more so than talking about the value of them. Unprepared maturity, client experience, again, to me, kind of shockingly high how people really aren't prepared. And a lot of that was really lack of training. People aren't really being given training there. Uh, Budgets for new types of technology around client experience. Uh, Cloud and open source, again, very reactive, not a lot of training there. While there was certainly budget for cloud, there wasn't a lot of thoughts on architecture and integration, more around tactical, taking what I have and putting this thing into the cloud, as opposed to thinking about cloud in a more transformative manner. So, what are some of the insights here? Data analytics, most important area. Almost everyone, it wasn't just financial services, pretty much everybody told me data and analytics is what we use to drive our business. It's how we make business decisions. If I have good information and I can make intelligent decisions on this information, that's how I drive my business. I've said this many times, but client experience far weaker than most people think. And again, people say it's important. People talk about clients being important, whether it's internal employees and their endpoints and how I'm using them as a client versus my actual clients that are giving me money. Uh, we say that they're important, but what I do in terms of budgeting for new technology, training for it, organizing for it, pretty big gap there for most people. Um, Cloud, a little bit of a bifurcation there. There was about 30% of the people that were in the anticipatory phase. They saw the value, they were planning, they were training, but there was a huge chunk of people that really were reacting to cloud more than they were being proactive about it. Um, and finally, on the security side, uh, new technology was where there wasn't value. Certainly, security itself is very important. 100% of people had training, people had staffing, people had money in their budgets, but they are not simply running at the new shiniest security thing that's coming along, which I think is actually probably good. Good for that to be the case. Now, finally, I just want to show you a sense of what the demographics were here. We had pretty good representation in terms of industries. You can see here, it's not all dominated by one. We certainly had a fair amount of financial services, but we also had IT outsourcing, IT consulting companies, manufacturing companies, higher education, aerospace and defense, advertising and marketing. So, pretty good segment by industry. Similarly, we asked people at the beginning of the survey, how do you perceive your IT culture? Are you leading, bleeding edge in terms of adopting technology? Are you aggressively adding new technology, moderate or conservative? And as you can see here, pretty broad swath of people in terms of maturity. Interesting thing for financial services, a lot of those are very big companies. They certainly use cutting edge technology, but many very, very large. I'm talking the like the top five, top 10 banks in the country. Those that we interviewed, pretty conservative. I mean, they see we have billions of dollars of clients' money at stake. There's a huge risk there. And so while we want to use new technology for analyzing, creating new programs, and that kind of thing, uh, people are not willy nilly adopting things. They really want to make sure there's no risk. You don't see, there's a very big aversion for large banks on using, say, like open source technology. Very, very risk averse for that kind of thing. They're willing to embrace things like cloud computing, but not necessarily putting customer protected information in a cloud that I don't directly control. So, pretty good cross section by culture. Interesting, they very small percentage of people that perceive themselves as leading edge slash bleeding edge. Most people were either, moderately aggressive, 41%, or moderate. And you can see between moderate and aggressive, that's really 70% of the respondees looking at technology. All right, I think that's the highlights of our findings. We are going to have upcoming episodes every Thursday at 11 Eastern Time, uh, and you can see here the dates. The next one we're going to go through the details of those findings in amplified intelligence and intelligent automation. Um, the next one, episode 3, will be trends in cloud computing and data analytics. Then the frontier technology and fintech. Episode 5 is workplace technology and infrastructure. And the last one we'll be doing is trends in security and privacy. If you want to look at these slides, we can make them available. You could join our Nemertes community online. We have you can see there www.nemertes.com/community. And we have, it's really our own private online community. It's really designed for technology professionals to talk about things like emerging technologies. And we welcome you to go on there and apply for an invitation. And if you're accepted, we put you there. I will say specifically, we don't put technology vendors in there. It's really, the intention is for end users, as opposed to vendors. But if you're an end user consumer of technology, we would love to have you in our community. And with that, thank you very much for attending. I do not have any questions, but we've got plenty of time. If anybody has any questions, we're certainly willing to entertain them at this time. I'll just wait another 30 seconds or so to see if we got any questions. I am not seeing any questions. And so, with that, thank you very much for coming on and seeing the summary of our research. Appreciate your time and attention. If you have any questions at all, any follow ups, you want any detailed questions, I'd be happy to answer them. My email's right there. Please, Jerald.murphy@nemertes.com. That's Jerald with a J because my parents did not know how to spell. So do not blame me. And with that, thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day, and look forward to seeing you hopefully in our Nemertes community.